Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being on. Thank you for being here for the season 2 of Drop the Mic Mondays. Something here at About Face that we really feel is important. My name is Natasha. I'm the organizing director at About Face. Thanks, everyone who's joining us, whether you're here on Facebook, YouTube, or on Twitter via Periscope platform. So again, thank you for joining us. Drop the Mic Mondays is really born out of a deep desire and really around our campaign around Drop the Mic, right? The mic meaning the military industrial complex. And depending on where you live, depending on if you're a veteran, a neighbor, I think the military industrial complex definitely touches us all. And so in order to have a breadth of conversations weekly, what we plan to do is invite veterans, scholars, activists, artists, to join us and share their experience and the work that they're doing to, push back on the dominant narrative around the military industrial complex, right? Something that I think is, super important for us to continue, again, just to educate each other. So if you're here with us, please feel free to drop comments and reflections in the chat. If you, no matter what platform you're on, we'll see those comments or questions that you have. And like I said, throughout the conversation, if we have time, we'll try to get to those. But again, it'll be great to see your reflections. So again, a little bit more on, like why we think it's super important to join us is to really break down not just the military industrial complex, but to talk about militarism, colonialism, imperialism, right? Racism that shows up in our communities from a systemic, structural, and institutional that leads to oppression of peoples, right? Whether it's here at home or abroad. And so again, these are, casual space that we, wanted to ensure that we can present. Today is season 2. So what we have coming up is a great conversation with long time About Face member Jovanni Reyes. We'll get to in an introduction here in a minute. But today, excited to have my new co-host on, Shiloh. Shiloh, please introduce yourself, and then let's get into today's conversation.
Thank you, Natasha. Hi, everyone. I'm Shiloh Emmeline. I'm a veteran U.S. Marines, and I'm the member coordinator at About Face. And I'm really excited to have Jovanni. And I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes. All right. Thanks, Shiloh, for being on. And what we're going to do is really have, we have such an awesome, conversation lined up. I really want us to get into it. I think for today's conversation, we really are talking about the ongoing conflicts that we are experiencing, whether you consume mainstream media or legacy media. It really does depend on, what type of lens you're approaching the ongoing conflicts, whether it's, with Ukraine, Russia, if it is in, across AFRICOM, if it is across the global South. So really, we're hoping to have a tip to tail conversation tonight. Today, we might go a little bit longer than usual, but that's okay. Jovanni is gracious with time and is going to spend some time with us today to sort of go through a lot of what has brought great discourse, particularly in the last, I would say, 2 months, is really around exceptionalism, is really around needing to have an understanding or some more historical context and background. And what we're seeing now is not new. So without, dragging on context, which I feel super excited about today's conversation, I'll yield. Shiloh, can you get us into an introduction of Jovanni, and then we can jump into the talk.
Yeah, I would love to introduce you, Jovanni. All right, our guest today is Joefani Reyes. He's an internationalist, an anti-imperialist, and an anti-interventionist veteran. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1993 and deployed to the Balkans in 1996 as part of NATO's first military intervention, which culminated in the dismemberment of Yugoslavia into 7 statelets. By 2002, he was no longer moved by the pretext and false narratives cheerleading for war. And when the invasion of Iraq began in 2003, he decided he could not support or continue in the military. He separated from the military in 2007. He holds an MS in international relations and is mostly interested in geopolitics and its relations to the global South, colonialism, Latin America, and pluralism. His writings has been published in Truth Out, Common Dreams, and Claridad. He has been a member of About Face IVAW since 2014. Jovanni is bilingual, fully fluent in Spanish and English. And thank you for being here, Jovanni. I was hoping that you could just kind of lead us. Yeah, thank you. I was hoping you could kind of lead us into, as Natasha alluded to, most things in mainstream legacy media in the US don't have much prior context given. And I was hoping you could give us a little bit more background, some history of what is happening today, and why we're here in this moment.
Sure. So, if just like Natasha mentioned earlier, depending on where you're getting your information, that's how your perception will reflect in your perception of this conflict. For one thing, the way if you consume if you consume your information from legacy media or mainstream media, for you, this conflict just started out of nowhere. Just happened. Just Vladimir Putin just woke up one morning and have a bad day and say, I think I'm going to just invade Ukraine just because, just for shits and giggles, right? So that's the perception you'll get if you just consume legacy media, because it doesn't give you a background, doesn't give you a backstory of how we got there. For one thing, conflicts just don't start out of the blue. It takes a lot of forethought. It takes a lot of things, because for one thing, it consumes a lot of resources. For one thing, when you go to war, so it consumes a lot of resources. So it takes a lot of forethought. It takes a lot of planning, and it takes a lot of incidents, the accumulation of incidents going on, accumulating over each other and whatnot. And that's something that the legacy media and some mainstream, some alternative media also follow the same line that the legacy media states. That's the perception they give you. They give you that this just started out of nowhere, and that's not true. I mean, I tell people that I have a conversation with about the conflict in Ukraine, that you have to put yourself in the shoes of Russia and the Russian people. I mean, Russia is a massive country. It's the largest country in the world. It has a long history. Of invasions and interventions in its territory and fighting off invaders and everything like that. It has it's about 160 million people live in Russia, and you gotta put yourself in their position of how things are leading up to where they are now. I mean, I tell people, think about the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, but in reverse. Here in the United States, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was mass hysteria. There was mass, the military was on call, to intervene. We were like in the brink of a third world war during that time, right? Luckily, President JFK, and at the time the premier of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, they managed to meet behind closed doors, right, and then de-escalated the situation. They did. The Soviets removed the missiles from Cuba, and the United States removed the missiles from Turkey, and and we were able to avoid a world war, a catastrophe, a nuclear war. This time around, it doesn't seem that way. This time around, they just keep pushing and pushing and escalating more and more and more.
Can you take us through a little bit of maybe some examples of how that pushing has taken place? Like, what are the escalations that you've seen?
Sure. So for one thing, you have to think about Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine and Russia, they share a history that goes over 1,000 years, right? They come from they're pretty much the same people. They come from a family group or ethno-linguistic group called Slavs, which which pretty much comprise of people in Eastern Europe. And they're like the Western Slavs, the Eastern Slavs, the Southern Slavs, and everything. So they comprise from the same family group. Most of Ukraine, what we see Ukraine today, most of Ukraine didn't really exist for, the state didn't exist for several centuries. The eastern part of Ukraine was part of Tsarist Russia since the 1700s. The western part of Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, they pretty much collapsed. Most of Western Ukraine went to either Hungary, Romania, or Poland. Russia, the Eastern Ukraine, stayed with Russia until the 1922, where they were given independence and they became the Social Republic of Ukraine. So yeah, going back to the borders that we see today in Ukraine is mostly a 20th century creation. I forgot what was your question again, Shala? I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay. I was just asking, like, what are the some like specific like poking and prodding that the U.S. and NATO have been doing to further escalate what we're seeing today?
Okay, so for one thing, the politics, the vis-a-vis politics between the United States and Russia, right? It didn't start today. The conflict didn't start today. It's just what we're seeing today is a culmination or an escalation to a conflict that started many years ago between the United States and Russia. For one thing, this current particular conflict didn't start in February 24, 2022. It started in February 2014 during the Maidan protests, the protests of dignity, they call it Revolution of Dignity, where among the protesters in the Maidan Square that went for several months, among the protesters, there was a reactionary wing or reactionary groups inside right-wing groups, right, that used the cover of the protest to overthrow the president of the country at that time, President Yanukovych, right? So they were clear that they didn't want a solution, a negotiated solution or peaceful solution to the grievances that the people in Maidan were having. At the time. They wanted Yanukovych out, and that's what happened. They even when he was fleeing the area, they even attempted to assassinate him. Actually, they attacked his convoy. He wasn't in the convoy, and from there, that's why he decided to take refuge in Russia. Right. So this is the start of the conflict, right? So when the people that came in power, which is pretty much there was a lot of U.S. backing behind this during the Maidan protests. I don't know if you can recall, there was several senators, American senators that were there, and they were pretty much egging on the protesters. McCain flew into Ukraine and met with the protesters and told the protesters that the United States is behind them. The United States supports them. You saw Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Fuck, the EU, Nuland. She was out there in the Maidan Square, passing out cookies to the protesters, telling them, egging them on to continue the protest and everything like that. Something that, if it was in reverse here in the United States, if you think about a Chinese diplomat or a Chinese ambassador or so forth, right, doing the Black Lives Matter protests here, in 2020, egging on the protesters and passing out cookies, people would lose their mind here, right? But yet this was happening in Ukraine at the time. So there was a leak. There was a leak recording between the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine, and Victoria Nuland, where they were actually deciding who's going to be the next president of Ukraine once Yanukovych is pushed out. They decided for next president. So this person became the next president of of Ukraine. And right immediately after this person became a new president of Ukraine, they started these draconian laws and rules. It brought in a lot of people from the right wing into government. There were paramilitary groups like the Azov, like the Right Sector, like the C-14. They pretty much were absorbed into the military. They were absorbed into the police. They were absorbed into the secret police and into government. Some of them took seats in as governors and so forth, right? So they initially went into established draconian laws, like they prohibited the language of Russia. They banned the Communist Party of Ukraine. They shut down the Russian Orthodox Church. There was an incident in Odessa where there were people that were against the coup. They were from the trades union. They were inside a trades building and they were pretty much resisting the coup. They were against the coup. These people were locked in the building, and the building was burned down with 42 people burned alive in that building. Right. Also, there were something that's not reported in mainstream media. But there was also a lot of defection. There's a lot of defection from the Ukrainian military. Many Ukrainian soldiers or military that were Russian speakers. Right. They did not agree with the coup, so they defected, and there were a large population of them. There were a large number of them. These former soldiers, these defectors, and the area of Crimea. So a lot of them, went in and just seized government buildings, and tried to battle off these other wing, of right wings, anti-Russians, going into the Crimea area. Crimea then did like a snap election to a referendum where they had votes and overwhelming support among Crimeans to separate from Ukraine and join Russia. Russia went ahead and seized and annexed this part of Ukraine, Crimea, which was part of Russia until the 1950s. So they annexed, and it has a huge Russian population inside Crimea. So they annexed this part. In the West, this was seen as an invasion, as a Russian invasion of Crimea. But there was, like I said, there was a referendum, and they voted for it, and there was huge support for joining Russia, rejoining Russia. Also, the areas of Donbass, there's cities of Lugansk and Donetsk. They also declared themselves independent from Ukraine. They didn't want to go ahead with the coup because they saw that the coup was pretty much directed at them. The Russians, ethnic Russian Ukrainians make up the largest minority group in Ukraine. So they saw that the coup and the policies that were being made was pretty much targeting them. So they didn't want to be a part of it, right? So they decided to break away. This caused a civil war. Initially, the people in Lugansk and Donetsk, right, they voted to join Russia, but Russia didn't accept them at the time, right? And instead of Russia with the Germany and with France, right, they wanted to manage the situation and they wanted to de-escalate. They brought the different parties into what is called the Minsk agreements, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But what I'm saying is that there was a civil war that broke out. The civil war went from 2014 all the way to 2022. According to the United Nations, 14,000 people died as a result of this conflict between the Ukrainian forces and the militias or the paramilitaries of Donbass. There were tens of thousands of people displaced because of this conflict, and there was shelling. There was continuous shelling against these territories for 8 years, and this was all happening while the mainstream media was silent about it. This was all happening while Ukraine was continuously getting massive support from NATO countries, massive weapons from NATO countries, training from NATO countries. They pretty much made the Ukrainian military a de facto part of NATO. Now, you want to go back to 2007. Back in 2007, there was a meeting, the Munich conference, where Vladimir Putin, said that that further NATO expansion into its sphere in Eastern Europe, and further American deployment of ballistic missiles closer and closer to a Russian borders, right? Will destabilize Europe and will create a European crisis, right? This was in 2007. Also, 2008, U.S. Ambassador to Russia William J. Burns wrote a memo to Washington in February 2008 entitled "Niet means Niet," and he was giving a warning to Washington that further NATO enlargement and antagonism toward Russia could trigger a major European crisis. And at the time, George W. Bush, right, was president, and despite this, right, they continued to egg on this expansion. They continued to hint that Ukraine and Georgia at the time would be, will be candidates to become NATO, despite the fact that the president of Russia at the time, right, warned that this would be destabilizing in Europe, right. So, given emboldened by U.S. support and everything, the president of Georgia at the time, he initiated this conflict where the Georgian military attacked peacekeepers, Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia and Abkhazia in August 2008. Now you ask why were the Russian peacekeepers in Georgia, right? So one of the things happened when the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, where at the time President Yeltsin pretty much dissolved the Soviet Union by decree, and broke the Soviet Union into 15 separate states. A lot of these separate states, there were a lot of ethnic Russians still living there, and the decision to dissolve the Soviet Union was never put like in a referendum and a vote and everything. So there were a lot of people that it took a lot of Russians by surprise, actually, that the Soviet Union was dissolved, and particularly Russians that were living in these other areas that were part of the Soviet Union. Then they became a separate country overnight. Like Ukraine became a separate country in 1991, and leaving like a majority, leaving a large group of ethnic Russians inside Ukraine. Same thing with Georgia. Same thing with other places as well. So a lot of these countries, these 15 nations, or these countries that separated from the Soviet Union, they started to enact this nationalist policy, because one of the things about the Soviet Union is that they downplayed nationalism, right? Because Soviet Union was they used the policy. Soviet Union was a socialist country, it was a worker state country. They pursued, or they supported internationalism rather than nationalism. So nationalism was kind of downplayed in support of the larger community, the largest Soviet state and whatnot. So a lot of these countries, when they broke away from the Soviet Union, when they became their own separate countries, then they became nationalists overnight, and they wanted to create a national identity, like a Georgian identity, a Ukrainian identity, an Estonian identity, a Latvian identity, etc., etc., etc. So people that were stuck into these countries, all these countries had multi-ethnicity. They were trying to be made. They were making them whatever country that. They were trying to be forced to be made whatever country they were in. So there were a lot of split loyalties. There was a lot of identity crisis going on here, and it still is. So this sparked the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, which only lasted 2 weeks. So that was a call right there. That was a warning call to the West that Russia pretty much means business. That further incursion to Russia's border by NATO, right, would destabilize Europe. It was said back in 1991, when the dissolution of the Soviet Union occurred. At the time, the premier, Gorbachev, right, met with the Bush Senior White House at the time. They agreed to let Germany reunite with Western Germany. Eastern Germany reunite with Western Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, on the condition that, and also let Eastern Germany enter NATO with the condition of not allowing NATO to move east an inch. And this was agreed upon. The Bush White House promised that NATO would not move an inch past Germany. But since 1999, NATO has been closer and closer into Russia's door. For one thing, the absorption of many of Yugoslavia's former republics. Yugoslavia was split up into 7 states, and many of these former republics became NATO countries overnight in 1999. Other countries like Estonia and Latvia, they became NATO countries. So NATO has been pushing forward and forward and forward and closer and closer and closer to Russia, concerning with little concern to Russian security concerns. So this is a long explanation, but we can talk about this all day. But this is pretty much the gist of what brought us to where we are today. Flirting these Eastern European countries, flirting with NATO countries, egging them on that we'll support you, and emboldening them. And this is where we are today.
Thank you so much for that background, the context, for setting all of this up. Definitely not getting that context and background in media. So I'm wondering, like, any humanist, right, wouldn't want to egg on a war, right? But why is this the U.S. strategy? Like, what are they trying to get at? What's the end goal for the U.S.? Why keep egging on this war? Why keep provoking this?
Well, I mean, this is very simple. I mean, we've been in a crisis. The West has been in a crisis. Since this new century started. This new century started with the invasion of Afghanistan, and then the invasion of Iraq. There were plans to continue to pretty much remake the whole Middle East during the Bush White House. So there's this messianic thought process, this messianic ideology. At the time, still today as well. So something interesting. So I know I touched on the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Well, in 1992, there was this doctrine that came out from the State Department. It's known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, right? And the Wolfowitz Doctrine, it was published by the New York Times, actually. The Wolfowitz Doctrine states that the United States will not tolerate any emerging powers or collection of states to rise that would challenge U.S. global hegemony or supremacy. That was after the fall of the Soviet Union. Because remember, during the Cold War, there were two powers. There were two separate global economy. There was the capitalist economy. There was the socialist economy. Each operated kind of independent. Independent from each other. They sometimes they merged. Like Yugoslavia was a socialist state, but Yugoslavia also did business with the West. But for the most part, there was two global economies. There were two global hegemons: the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union pretty much, there was this arms race. The Soviet Union threw in the towel in 1991. They decided to end the Cold War, and they wanted to integrate into the West. That's initially they wanted to integrate into the West. However, they were always seen as suspicion, right? They were always seen as suspicious. So we have this doctrine. We have also the Brzezinski, for example. Brzezinski was the chief strategist of the Carter administration, also an influencer in American geostrategy. He always saw you know, he was also very deeply anti-communist, right? He stated that Russia without Ukraine was is not a superpower, right? So there's always the intent of decoupling, of separating Ukraine from Russia, right? Remember, prior to the Maidan protests in 2014, Russia and Ukraine, they share a border, so they had a integrated economy with each other. They were close to each other. They had an integrated economy with each other. A lot of Ukrainian also held Russian passports, so they were going back and forth and everything like that. So the Maidan protests put an end to that. So that was part of Brzezinski's thought, is to separate Ukraine from Russia. Also, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union broke into 15 different states. Brzezinski wanted to further break up Russia, into 3 or 5 more states, to make Russia smaller and weaker, because the idea is to keep Russia weak, to keep Russia from ever challenging U.S. power again. So that was the idea. So after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia wanted to integrate into the Western sphere, into the Western global economy. I already mentioned Yeltsin. Yeltsin was the first president of Russia, the new Russian Republic. He opened the door to the global capitalists, to the Western capitalists. And what was applied in Russia was called the shock therapy. Shock therapy, the people like Jeffrey Sachs and other people, they entered Russia, and what they wanted to do, they wanted to transform the Russian economy, which was a centrally planned economy, into a free market economy like that, really fast, right? They wanted to use what is called a shock therapy on them, right? So what was the shock therapy? The shock therapy, is to liberalize the economy in Russia, right? But what happened? They took the state enterprises, they privatized all state enterprises, they state assets, they plundered it, and foreign capitalists, by foreign capitalists, the newly created class, the billionaire class in Russia that happened after the 91. We call them oligarchs here, right? And they're very demonized, but they also played a role in pretty much plundering Russia for the global capitalists. Standard of living fell greatly among average Russians, right? There was a rise in crime, insecurity, unemployment, hunger, diseases, it caused mass migrations of Russians. The life expectancy in Russia during this period, during the 90s, fell really, declined, really significantly. There were attempts to restore Russia and they tried to overthrow Yeltsin. However, during his election in 1996, despite being unpopular, he won with the help of the United States. The United States poured millions and millions of dollars to make sure that Yeltsin won the re-election. Talk about remember last year, was it a couple of years ago, Russiagate, saying that Russia stole the election. I mean, this is still in the election, pouring millions and millions of dollars, right, to make sure that Yeltsin won, to continue with the plunder and everything. So when Putin was in the Yeltsin cabinet, he was actually became Yeltsin's vice president. So when Yeltsin stepped down in '99, the West wanted Putin to continue, because they thought they were going to have another Yeltsin, right? Keep in mind that the second largest party in a political party in Russia is the Russian Communist Party. They're the largest party, the largest opposition party in Russia, right? And what the West wanted to avoid, that the Communist Party, came back to power. So that's why they're making all this effort for Yeltsin to continue to win. Yeltsin was an alcoholic. He was a bumbling fool. He did a lot of disappearances, and he'll come to the United States to one of those night shows and utter some foolish words and do some dancing and everything and whatnot. So the West loved Yeltsin. He was that kind of guy you want to have a drink with. He was a fun guy, but he couldn't manage his country, right? So when Putin came into power in 1999, they thought that they were going to get another Yeltsin. It was a continuous Yeltsin. However, Putin applied was a Bonaparte, what's called Bonaparte approach to politics in Russia. And what Bonaparte is, it comes from Louis Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, in the 1840s. And this was a term coined by Karl Marx. It was a time in France where there was also a lot of instability, a lot of misery, a lot of conflict. And when Louis Bonaparte came into power, with the name Bonaparte because of Napoleon. Napoleon was very popular at the time among the working class, the French working class, the peasants, and so on and so on, right? So he came to power. So he applied a policy to stabilize the French economy, to stabilize social, bring social stability, and that's the same thing Putin did. And that's what you call this type of leader. You call it Bonaparte's leadership, right? So that's what happened. I lost my train of thought there. So what was your?
Yeah, I was just asking about the continued escalation, but I also want to ask, did you want to keep going on that thought? Are you back on your train or?
So what I'm trying to bring you to the escalation of this, right? When the West realized that they were not getting another Yeltsin with Putin, right? That's when the relationship between Russia and the West started to sour. Particularly when Russia was not voting Russia weren't voting the Western way, when Russia was challenging the West. For example, in the war against Yugoslavia, Russia protested that war and challenged the West on that war, and Russia did not recognize Kosovo, for example. Kosovo was a province of Serbia, and Serbia was bound by NATO for 72 days into submission until they were and the province of Kosovo was recognized as a state, despite Serbia's never mind what Serbia said, So, but Russia protested that and continued not to recognize Kosovo as a state. So when they started seeing that Putin wasn't another Yeltsin, then Putin wasn't our guy anymore. Wasn't our guy. First because they supported the first election because they didn't want a communist to come into power after Yeltsin. So they supported that election. But then when they started seeing that they were not getting another Yeltsin, then that's where the relationship started to sour. One thing is that I don't know if I mentioned to you. Yeah, I did mention about the MAD doctrine, the mutual assured destruction during the Cold War, which kept the Soviet Union and the United States from nuclear annihilating each other. The policy was that neither the Soviets or the United States would try to get any advantage over each other. As long as there were missiles pointing at each other, and neither tried to get any advantage of each other, right? Knowing that if they will go to war, there will be mutually a destruction amongst the both, right? Then that will deter a nuclear war. So one of the things that happened in 2001 was that George W. Bush, unilaterally, right, destroyed this document, what is it? Can't recall right now. The NBA treaty. So the NBA treaty, the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, was pretty much the United States withdrew from it in 2001, and that was something that kept the MAD doctrine alive, right? So now, when the United States withdrew unilaterally from the ABM treaty, that enabled the United States to put more interceptor missiles and interballistic missiles in Europe, right? What does that mean? That means that if the Russians were to launch missiles to the United States will have an advantage over them because they will have interceptors in Europe already that can intercept those missiles coming to the United States. However, the Russians didn't have that. So if the United States were to launch missiles into Russia, they wouldn't have those intercepted missiles, right? So the United States was getting an advantage over Russia when Bush pretty much withdrew from the ABM. Then to add, to further instigate, or to add, I forgot the expression. The Trump administration would later tear up the INF treaty, right, which is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. That was in 2019. So that further destabilized, that further brought Europe closer into crisis. What that means is that the United States were able to set nuclear, intermediate range nuclear missiles closer into Russia. With the new NATO countries, given that these countries became NATO countries, now they, as a NATO member, you have what they call interoperability, meaning that your military is trained by NATO. That means that your military can work with NATO under NATO leadership and, pretty much grow NATO. And at the same time, you allow your territory, you open your territory for NATO operations, whereas military exercise, have NATO positioned weapons there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now by Trump, tearing up the INF, that means that the United States can put these intermediate range missiles closer into Russia, right? So those right there were the stabilizing factors there. With the continued relations with Ukraine, with the 2014 Maidan protests and overthrow push of the government. Another thing that mainstream media doesn't mention about Ukraine is that during the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Ukraine was part of the coalition of the willing. Ukraine sent about 5,000 to 7,000 troops into Iraq to support the invasion and occupation of Iraq. So there, they also got experience with NATO countries, mainly the United States, and so forth, right? So that right there, all these things will add up to where we are today. So that right there makes sure what I just mentioned now, just made sure that they were, led up to the crisis we're on today.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you and kind of pivot towards like the media, and when I say media, I mean like capital M, like mainstream legacy media. I kind of ask you some questions about that. As you mentioned before, it's very much the media wants us to think that this conflict just erupted on February 24th. And you did a great job of explaining that, all the context leading up to where we're at today. I was wondering if you could kind of summarize in your view, like how mainstream media is covering this conflict. Like what words would you use to describe that? And then go into like why is mainstream media like covering it that way, as opposed to giving us full context? And yeah. Can you go ahead and talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So American media, so keep in mind that 90% of what we watch, what we listen, what we read, come from 5 or 6 companies, right? They manage, this. So we have a monopoly of information in the United States, right? And think about this: that when we talk about, like, in the United States, the Constitution talks about the free media, etc. And one of the barometers of freedom that the United States use against other countries is that they don't have a free media, they have a state media and everything. But think about that: our media are corporate media. Our media are media for profits, for-profit media. And there's a saying within the media journalistic world, if it bleeds, it sells. So this conflict bleeds, right? So this would sell. So one of the things that one of the phenomena that was happening during the Trump era is that the American media, particularly the liberal media, they could not stop talking about Trump, and every time Trump tweeted something, they were just nonstop, talking about it for 24/7 about what Trump tweeted that morning and everything like that, right? So because it was bringing a lot of ratings, so that's how they get the money. They get rating, advertising, etc., 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 right? So this with war is the same. So if you notice with every war, because I recall when in 2003 when the Iraq invasion occurred, right? They could not stop showing, particularly when the shock and awe, happened, when they were bombing Baghdad, bombing Baghdad for weeks, and it was daytime here, but it was nighttime over there, and you saw it with sparkles and everything, like you felt like you were watching a 4th of July spectacle. The media was the mainstream media would show those images nonstop, right? Because it bled, right? Because it bled, it brought viewership, it brought profits in advertising and everything. One of the things that they lamented recently is that when Trump lost the election, that's one of the things that came from medias like CNN and stuff. They lamented that they didn't have Trump anymore, and they saw the ratings, fell. With this conflict, the rating has increased again, and it's in their profit margin, it's in their economic interest to continue piggybacking off of this, right? To continue projecting this over and over and over and over again, right? So if you look at how their narrative is pretty much uniform across the board, right? The narrative is always with Russia bad, Putin bad, right? And the thing is also they project, or they cultivate, hate and racism towards the targeted country. Before Russia, it was Islam. Before Russia, it was Islam. And they won't, like other networks like Fox. They were overtly Islamophobes, right? But you saw networks like MSNBC where they were politely Islamophobe. So in this form right now, Islam is not in. Now Russia's Islam is out of style. Now Russian is in style. So now they all become Russophobes, right? So now it's continuously bombardment of how evil and how bad and how maniacal Putin is. They make it sound like one of the narratives I was first hearing about when this conflict. This is the first time, and since the Second World War, where a European country is attacked. That's not true. They simply all forgot about Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was attacked from 1995 to 1999, right? And there's still an occupation force in former Yugoslavia. And they seem like to forget about the last 22 years of warfare. They seem to forget about, they forgot about the 20-year occupation of Afghanistan. They forgot about the 8-year, 10 years, or I don't know, because it's still going on. The war in Iraq. They forgot. They forgot about the destruction of Libya. They forgot about the destruction of Yemen. They forgot about the destruction of Syria. They forgot about all of that, right? They're trying to starve out Venezuela, trying to starve Iraq. They forget about all of that, right? Right now, this is it. This is the only conflict that matters, right? And this is the one that this is the one that's bringing in the ratings. This is the one they're going to focus on, right? Another thing is that anything that runs contrary, because how they like to castigate, a lot of ideologues here in the United States like to castigate other countries, saying that state media. If you look at YouTube and you see let's say you look at RT or whatnot, it says Russian affiliated media, Russian state media. If you look at Hispan TV, or you look at Press TV, Iran state media, something like that, right? But if you look at when there's conflict, when there's wars, right, all U.S. media becomes state media, because what they do, they propagate the same state line, and they don't counter it. They propagate the same state line, so they all become state media. Yeah. So and they make sure that this line continue, the editorial lines continue. If you look at in 2003, for example, where reporters that were trying to they're trying to report on an alternative line, alternative narrative of the war in Iraq. Like, for example, like Phil Donahue or Chris Hedges from the New York Times, they got fired. They got fired because their reporting didn't go in line with what the narrative was. The dominant narrative was support the troops, support the invasion of Iraq. Because they went counter to that, they got sent away or they got shut down. Right now we have a little bit more media. They don't control the message like they did 20 years ago, because there's a lot of, like we are right now, we're doing a form of media, people's media. There are more alternative media. A lot of younger people are turning away from this legacy media, and they're going mostly into alternative media and stuff. So they don't really control the narrative like they used to do before. So what do? They co-opt it now. They co-opt it with some of these alternative medias, right? Alternative personalities. Like, if you look at them, they're saying the same state line. Some of these alternative media, they're saying the same thing. But they don't have the same control anymore as before. So what do? Also, they shut it down. They shut down RT, they shut down Press TV, they shut down any alternative message, any alternative view. They'll shut it down. Even American reporters, they get their Twitter accounts shut down because of the algorithms, or because they hit on something that went counter to the dominant narrative. Now, I don't know if you recall, a few days ago, a week ago, the Biden administration announced this new czar, this new person that's responsible of controlling disinformation. What does that mean? What does that mean, controlling disinformation? So right now, because they don't have a dominant role, they don't have control of what is said, what is propagated to the masses. So now they're reacting in this fashion. So that was a long explanation to your question.
No, that was great. I remember you actually taught me about the hegemony of U.S. media and the leading up to the war, the invasion of Iraq, where all of a sudden there was no debate on whether or not we should go to war. It was how are we going to go to war? That was what was covered differently from the pundits on Fox versus the pundits on CNN. It wasn't a debate on whether we should engage in war. It was how are we going to do it? Yes, I appreciate that. And I had one more question around media coverage and how, what are some of the contradictions that you're seeing and how this is being covered as opposed to all the other conflicts that are happening globally, right? That we're not really hearing about. What are some contradictions in how this is being covered? And then also, what are some contradictions you're seeing in how the Ukrainian people and refugees are being treated and covered in the media?
Yeah, so one of the main contradictions that comes across to me is that before February 24, 2022, there were reports in mainstream media, in New York Times and some other New York media and what is it, the BBC, the Guardian. There were reports of the growing influence that the fascists and Nazis were having in Ukraine. There were reports about they were shutting down parties that were seen sympathetic to Russia. They were shutting down channels. They were shutting down radio stations. They were shutting. They even imprisoned a mayor from a town somewhere, right, who was seen as sympathetic to Russia. So all that was happening. They were reporting in mainstream media. They also, there was a report also about how Ukraine was becoming a magnet for the international extreme right. They were flying in from different countries, including the United States, Canada, parts of Latin America, all through, across Europe. They were getting ideological training because Ukraine became this symbol of the international right wing of what a Nazi, what they call national socialist or Nazi or fascist, countries should be, because one of the things that they wanted to do when they overthrew the Yanukovych, when they overthrew him, is they introduced this policy of the Ukrainization. They want to Ukrainize. They want to Ukrainize Russia, Ukraine. They wanted racial purity. Some of these organizations like the ASAF, for example, they wanted racial purity in Russia, in Ukraine. So all this was being reported. All this was being reported in mainstream media and in some of these papers and whatnot. Maybe not in visual and like in TV or corporate media, but that's another thing. Like, most people get their news from sound bits, from television and stuff like that. And there's another group of people that get their media, by text reading and stuff like that, right? But in text media, there's a lot of reporting going on of what was happening. But when Russia intervened in February 24th, right, all that reporting went away. All of a sudden these fascist groups, these Nazi groups, right, they didn't exist anymore. They they became the good guys. They didn't exist anymore. They, all of a sudden, Ukraine became just one people. That's a racist trope. It's a racist trope saying that when you homogenize a group of people, making everyone the same, seeing everyone as one group of people. If you don't represent, for example, when you say I support the Ukrainian people, you gotta ask yourself, which Ukrainian people? Just like if I was in the outside, in the outside, and I say I support the American people, which American people? Do you support the American people that are partisan toward Trump? You support the American people that are partisan towards Hillary Clinton? Which and because we're not a homogenized nation, and you couldn't expect that no country is homogenized that way. It's a very racist trope, very racist way of looking at states and countries and whatnot. One of the things that the mainstream media is not reporting is that when you said about the Ukrainian people, that they're actually Ukrainian militias fighting side by side with Russian troops, and that's something that you don't get in in mainstream media. Because remember, right, for 8 years they were in a civil war. For 8 years they were, before the Russian intervention, they were in a civil war. So when Russia entered the conflict, on the side of the ethnic Russian people of Donetsk and Lugansk, right, they had their militias that were fighting off the right-wing Ukrainians, right? They joined in the fight with the Russian troops. So you don't see that because they're the wrong kind of Ukrainians. That's not the Ukrainians we want to hear from. We want to hear about the Ukrainians that leaves, that are saying, how evil and how bad and how nasty the Russians are. Those are the ones that we want to listen to. Well, that's the one we want to hear from. We don't want to hear from the other Ukrainians, the ones that have a grievance to, that didn't support the coup, the ones that were fighting against the coup government and whatnot. So that's one thing that the media doesn't report. Another way the media is not reporting is that, I don't know if you recall the early weeks of reporting from mainstream press, English speaking media, how they keep talking about how Ukraine is not like the other countries, where they're actually a civilized people. They're actually part of Europe, and this was so extraordinary, to them. They're not like the other ones. They're not like the Iraqis or the Yemenis. They're blonde hair, blue eyed people. That's one way that that's one distinction that not only I made, but a lot of people in the global South have made. Because one of the strategies with this war, right? Because I'm convinced that this was a bait, was tried to bait Russia into this conflict. One of this conflict was to isolate Russia from the world and just and introduce these extreme sanctions. Right now, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. Before it was Iran, but right now Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. But if you look at the countries who are sanctioning Russia, are mainly Western European countries or NATO countries. NATO countries are the one who's sanctioning Russia, right? The rest of the world are not. Russia belonged to the what it's called the BRIC countries, right? This was an economic integration countries of that started out in the early 2000s, which is a economic bloc of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, right? So they were considered the fastest growing emerging economies in the world. None of the BRIC countries are sanctioning Russia. None of them. And the UN and India and South Africa are U.S. allies. However, they're not going along with it because it's not in their interest. Israel is a close knit. What did Obama say, that we have a bond? I forgot what he called it. I forgot the word he used. It. Unconditional ally, whatever this and that, right? Whatever that he used, Obama, right? Israel's not sanctioning Russia. So it's not in their interest. So the countries are mainly sanctioning Russia. So in that aspect, it failed. It failed from getting the whole world to isolate Russia. Russia is the first major economy that the United States attempt to sanction. And by the way, unilateral sanctioning of a country goes against the international law. But the United States have been sanctioning about 30 countries for the last 20 years or so. But that failed. That have failed. But the only countries that are actually sanctioning Russia is Western Europe. So that's not mentioned. That's not delved upon. That's not really included. They've been pressuring countries too. I mean, the Biden administration went to India to try to pressure the Indian government to sanction Russia. They went to China to try to pressure the Chinese government to sanction Russia. They went to Iran. They went to Venezuela. Pakistan, and several other countries are, pressuring them to sanction Russia, but they haven't. Another way that the media is not covering this fact, and also another way the media is covering this conflict, which is very odd, is they have this president Zelensky just flying around in Under Armour camouflage or Under Armour military suede color, right? Just flying around and talking to all these governments, talking to the U.S. government, talking to the Canadian government. He's a celebrity now, right? But he was an actor before. But he's playing a role here, right? For getting more and more and wanting more and more weapons being poured into Ukraine and everything, right? And the way the media here is portraying is that the Ukrainian military is just kicking butt left and right, and just kicking butt left and right of the Russian military, which is further from the truth, because the Russian military controls the airspace in Ukraine. Russian military controls huge swaths of territory, particularly the eastern and the southern coastlines of Ukraine. And many of the deliveries that Ukraine is getting from the West, a lot of these heavy weaponry, tanks, are artillery pieces and everything. As soon as they touch inside Ukraine, they get destroyed by Russian missiles. So that's another way that the media is distorting the facts on the ground. The facts on the ground on the what's happening in Ukraine. They're painting an image. They're packaging this war as if this is a liberation war, as if the Ukrainians are just kicking butts left and right. And that's further from the truth.
Yeah, I have a that leads me to my a question that's come up and listening to you and talking about interest and talking about the financial the expedited way in which finances has been sent. I think there's also a $30+ billion ask from President Biden right now. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about you're talking about the military equipment. We know that there's benefactors, right? And those who profit from this. Can you talk a little bit about how the weapons manufacturers are profiting in this moment, right? Which then goes to the whole point around the military industrial complex. It's not oftentimes it's not just what you see and what's being reported. There's so much at play, and it's definitely nuanced. Can you talk a little bit about those weapon manufacturers at this time?
Oh man, they've been getting a bonanza. I mean, this has been like the stock markets are off the roof with this conflict, right? I mean, think about this. I mean, Lloyd Austin, for example, he's the what is the Secretary of Defense of the Biden White House, right? He used to be a lobby for Raytheon, I believe, right? For Raytheon, lobbyist for Raytheon. So yeah, so the money is, I mean, it's going out. I mean, I think didn't Biden just upped the budget from like 800 billion to like 813 billion, something like that.
That's right.
Um, yeah, so I mean, they're making a killing. I mean, they forced. I mean, this conflict has forced Germany, for example, has forced Germany to rearm. Germany right now, Germany had a low after the Second World War. Germany demilitarized, and they had a very low military budget, right? And they pretty much subordinate themselves to the U.S. I mean, Germany is a country in Europe with the most American military bases in Europe. I think there's 40,000 U.S. troops in Germany, or so, something like that. So they, by not spending in their military, right, they were able to reconstruct, and they were able to provide social welfare to their citizens, and so on and so forth and so forth, right? But now Germany announced that they will start spending 100 billion euros on their military. They're starting to rearm, right? So the last two times that that Germany rearmed, armed themselves, right, to such extent in the 20th century, right, it didn't go well for the rest of the world. So yes, that's something to think about. But yeah, but they're making a killing. They just made. I mean, so that money that's being sent, if you look at that much, Ukraine is not paying that money. Ukraine right now is not paying all that money. All the billions of dollars are being poured into Ukraine. That money is coming from taxpayers, right? So the companies are sending are getting these large orders of weapons, right, to send to Ukraine, and they're getting their money. They're not giving Ukraine an IOU. They're getting the money up front. And where does the money come from? So if Ukraine is not currently paying that money, where is that money coming from? So that money is coming actually from taxpayers. So the taxpayers are subsidizing this war. And then when in the future Ukraine becomes Ukraine becomes, if they're still Ukraine, becomes stabilized and everything, and they start generating income, then they'll start paying back the money. They'll start paying back. So now Ukraine's going to be in a debt. It's going to be in long-term debt to all these countries that have been pouring so much money into Ukraine. So Ukraine will eventually be a colony of these countries. But yeah, I mean, they're making a killing out of this conflict.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that before. I just want to remind folks, please visit the Cost of War Project. We had Stephanie on, who's one of their directors, who, their project and their website, I think it really is Cost of War Project, perhaps edu, but just Google that, and you get an understanding of the, for the last, just 20 years, what the military industrial complex, how it is profited. It is no different than what you may have read in the Afghanistan papers. And again, however you consume media, I think you have a clear understanding of what Jovanni is sharing with us. Really does just bring, to the mindset, like, none of this is new. It really isn't new. But what I think, and then leading to the question that's coming up for me is, it's easy to, get into the mindset of, this is a runaway train. What can we do in this moment to organize? I know, many of the, anti, war, movement space has really been, I would say perhaps stagnated in a way in terms of response, because it's hard to cut through the media propaganda. And so, given everything that you're, sharing with us today, and I know that you're in, community spaces, what's a good way for folks to, apply pressure? We have a political season coming up. where folks are vying for the people's votes. It will be just good to hear, like, how are folks, what should they do with this information?
I mean, it's important to know that, Natasha, this is a bipartisan conflict. This is a conflict that are supported. It's a consensus. It's supported by both parties. You just mentioned elections. That's why I mentioned this right now. We're not going to elect our way out of this conflict, right? It's going to be continue on. So that's one thing to understand. Before you find a solution to a problem, you got to understand the problem first, right? So that's one problem. It's bipartisan. Two, we have to understand that we're going through major global shifts right now. For the last 20 or 40 years, we've been going through major global shifts right now where power is transferring from the West to the East and to everywhere else. What did I mean by that? For the last 500 years, right, since 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the West have been generating power until it culminated, and pretty much controlled the world. Pretty much colonized majority of the world landmass. 18th, 19th century, early until half of the 20th century. So for the first time in like 500 years or 400 years or so, right, power is leaving the core, the Western core, and going towards the East and everywhere else. Right? What do I mean by everywhere else? Well, it's going to the global South, it's going to Africa, it's going to South America. So power is being disseminated, across the board. And as power gets disseminated across the board in other places, right, it reduces the influence the West have, right? And that puts the West in a very vulnerable, uncomfortable position because it's not used to this. It's been holding power for the last 500 years, and now they're seeing their power go away, right? The power being transferred somewhere else. So expect there's going to be conflict. It's going to be conflict, right? So that's one of the things I want to point out. Don't believe the media, because the media is part of this system. It's part of this system. The legacy is part of the system. They're going to protect the system, right? That's one thing. Another thing I want to close with is, addressing your question is, right, that we need to make clear demands. We need to make clear demands. And for one thing, we need to mobilize a mass anti-war movement. I mean, the Iraq War caused even before it started, the largest mass anti-war movement, in U.S. history. Put more people outside than any other, in the street than any other time. Once the war started, and they started changing the narrative, and they started, the Bush administration started using the slogan. The slogan started being, protected, support the troops. If you go out there, you're not supporting the troops, and whilst by supporting the troops, you're supporting the war. So, so once it started playing with all this language, this lingo and stuff, people just pretty much started abandoning the street, particularly also when Obama came into power. People, the so-called anti-war movement just left. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the anti-war movement is partisan, right? Because when you had your guy in office, then there's no need to go outside, because now you're undermining his government. So one thing we have to understand, this is bipartisan. This is a bipartisan consensus, right? Both the Democrats and Republicans, right? They're warmonger parties, right? So we got to understand that, both world wars were under Democratic government. The Iraq War, the Vietnam War was under a Democratic president. So we got to understand that. So we need to mobilize. We need to create a mass movement independent from these parties, independent from electoral politics. And we need to put people in the streets, and we need actions, and we need to get away from these purist politics. Well, this organization didn't come correct, so I'm not going to mess with this organization. We need put our purity politics in a coat hanger, right? and get to business to where we have to be, right? We need to demand that NATO countries refrain from further escalating this crisis, right? This is very dangerous, and a lot of people don't understand that this can. Right now, we're seeing a mini world war in Ukraine, because this is not war. This war is not Ukraine versus Russia. This war is Russia versus NATO, or NATO versus Russia. They just happen to use Ukraine as proxies. They just happen to use Ukraine as a battleground, but it's actually a war against NATO war against Russia, right? So we need to understand that. So we need to demand that NATO countries de-escalate, stop escalating, de-escalate. We need to make contact with other NATO countries, because we can't, as citizens of the United States, we only have control of what our government do. We can't start lecturing and dictating what other governments are doing, right? So if we can't put our own government in check, how do we expect to put other countries' governments in check, right? So that's one thing we need to think about. So demand NATO countries to de-escalate, demand to end the sanctions against Russia. That's not going to help. That's making the problem worse. That's affecting a whole lot of people outside of Russia as well, that depend on Russia. For example, Russian wheat, that contributes to the global, to a global food crisis that's happening. So we need to demand the end of sanctions. Sanctions kill, right? Sanctions is another way of war. It's another way of making war, right? We need to demand to end all hostilities and return to a negotiating table. Another thing, we need to demand that to end this conflict, it should be a mission of international states. It should be an international mission of non-NATO countries, because NATO countries are part of the problem. They're not part of the solution, right? So there is a conflict of interest here, right? So NATO countries shouldn't get involved in the mediation of negotiations of to end this conflict. It should be an international mission from various non-NATO countries. They need to be empowered to mediate, and also the Ukrainian diplomats need to negotiate seriously, free of any restraints from what NATO countries are telling them to do, or their own, fascist elements within their government that are seeing this conflict as epic, like some type of epic battle, and they're willing to see it through the end. They need to be free of those elements. They need to be free of NATO control to negotiate for the well-being of their home country if they want to maintain their country.
What's other places? This has been a great conversation, by the way. Thank you so much, Jovanni, for covering so much for us. I guess my final question, before we move to final thoughts, is what would you recommend people, read to learn more, to just up their knowledge? What has really, I think it comes up for me in this moment, is I've realized how much political education is needed throughout our movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I'm curious, I mentioned the Cost of War project. If folks are catching live, conversations like these, what would you say, folks could do, or where can they tap in for more knowledge?
Absolutely. So I didn't come prepared with a list of books, but yes. So the thing is that, like you said, we need to educate ourselves. We need to educate our groups. We need to educate our the people that we're on the streets with. Because when you're all about action, like we saw with this last couple of years, that were people on the streets doing actions and everything, right? But they have no clear guidance or clear goal, or where they wanted to take this to, right? When you have action without theory, all you're doing is engaging in adventurism. All you're doing is engaging in adventurism, right? However, the same token, right, when you're all about theory and no action, right, that pretty much is dead, because what you're doing is just allowing the system to continue the same way. So it has to be a combination of both, right? But we need to have an educated group. I mean, unfortunately, our school system, our current school system doesn't provide us that, because our current school system, right, pretty much keep the our thoughts, within the American borders, right, and only prepare us to get a job, but not actually to think more critically of what's the world, of our world. So yeah, so we need to have education. I mean, right now I follow this American journalist, right, named Patrick Lancaster, right, and he's been living in Ukraine since before the Maidan. I believe he's a former Navy guy, Navy veteran, and he has his wife and kids there as well. And he's been reporting, actually, right, since 2014 of what's been happening in the Donbass areas and whatnot. And you can follow him. I think he has a YouTube channel, Twitter. There's another veteran also that does a lot of good reporting of what's happening, not only in Ukraine, but also the proxy, the escalation that's happening right now in the South China Sea. And that's another thing that the mainstream media is not talking about, what's happening in what they call the Indo-Pacific, the South China Sea. His name is Brian Berletic. Brian Berletic. He's a former Marine, and he lives in also overseas. He lives in the I think he lives in either Thailand or Indonesia, I forget. But he's also does a lot of reporting on what's happening, and not only in the South China Sea and the politics that's happening over there, and the escalation that's happening with antagonizing China, which is, we're seeing the same thing. We could today we could be real. We could, instead of talking about Ukraine, we could be talking about Taiwan today, because the same thing is happening in that side of the world as well. So those two people I recommend that to follow to get more knowledge on them. Also, I also follow this guy named Pepe Escobar, right? Pepe Escobar, he's a geopolitical analyst. He's from Brazil, but he's been living in Eurasia for decades now. I believe he said 40 years or so. But we gotta understand that the crisis that we're in is a crisis due to our economic structure. That's another thing that we need to understand. Our economic structure is not viable. It's not viable, so we need to find other economic systems, that's more viable, that are less prone to conflict, because our current economic system is very prone to conflict. So that's another thing that we need to think about.
Yeah, it's almost as if it's muscle memory. I just saw the delegation that went, or reporting of the delegation that recently went, I think, to Poland with the Speaker of the House. And I was actually surprised to see Barbara Lee on that. And so it really does. Who was the lone holdout on the original AUMF, or the authorization for what led to the invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? But I guess there's so much that I think we could talk about. We really could go on for another hour, but I think it'll be good if anyone has any questions, please drop those in the chat. Jovanni, let's see. Let's move to some closing or just final thoughts. Is there something that you had on your mind that you think in this moment where we're talking about political education is so important, that you would like to share? And then immediately following, Shiloh will also share some final thoughts, and then we'll move to close.
Yeah, I want to point out also that going back to also what Shiloh mentioned about the way media is covering. I want to, people need to understand that the way the media covers the conflict there, it's packaged for a liberal lefty audience. That's why you see the most emotionally invested people in this conflict tend to be people who identify as liberal and lefty people, right? Because that's the way it's been packaged to project, because it is assumed that people of more conservative by people in power, but people who are more conservative, we just go along. We just go along with American power, America first, you know, you know, America on top and everything like that. But it's always the people of the liberal wing, the people of the left that tend to challenge a little bit power in that sense, So that's why the media packages this in a way that is palatable to people, to a liberal and more lefty audience. Those making it about human rights, those making it about this and making it about that, the babies and everything like that. Just keep that in mind. Also, whatever you think about Vladimir Putin, because they made this conflict all about Putin. Everything's about Putin. He's the only reason this is happening. Whatever you think about Putin, right? You got to understand that he's the president of Russia. He has one job to do, and his one job is to defend security of Russia, right? And that's his number one job: defend the security of Russia, right? And they have this thing called the indivisibility of security, which is something in international law, is that you cannot enhance your security at the cost of another person's security. So they have to be, it has to be equal, right? And also keep in mind that for Russia, this is an existential threat. The United States are not used to. The United States have been fighting this ongoing war for like the last 22 years. But the wars that the United States have been fighting in are not existential. It's not a war that where if the United States lose, the United States, will be no more tomorrow. For Russia, this is existential because it's right there on their border. It's right there on the border, and you see all these countries crouching out there on the border. Keep in mind that in the 20th century alone, Russia have been invaded 4 times. 4 times. First by the Kaiser, by Germans in World War One, then by a collection of 14 states, a coalition of 14 states in which the United States participated and Japan participated in 1918 to try to overthrow the Bolshevik from power, right? Then Poland invaded in 1920, right, to try to take land from Russia, seeing that Russia was weak because it came out of a First World War, then a revolution, then a civil war, etc. So they try to muscle and take land from Russia in 1920, and then they got invaded again in 1941 by Nazi Germany, right? So they've been invaded 4 times in 1 century. The last time the United States have been invaded by a foreign power was in 1812. So that needs to register in people's mind that the way that the Russians are seeing this conflict is very different than the way Americans see this conflict.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to close with just so much gratitude and thankfulness for all your clarity and just plotting out the historical context and of why we're seeing this playing out right now and where we've seen this play out before, and like the imperialist playbook that we're seeing repeated over and over. I think that I always try to express, if things make you uncomfortable because they maybe go against what you've thought, to just kind of lean into that discomfort and continue asking why am I uncomfortable with this? And yeah, we've talked about the historical context today, the influence of and ongoing contradictions in mainstream media, and we've talked about the exceptionalism that's being projected onto us about Ukraine versus all the other conflicts happening currently. And yeah, I think in closing, I would just express my gratitude always for you, Jovanni, for being so thoughtful and so gracious with your time and your knowledge. Yeah, that's all I have for closing. Just a lot of gratitude.
Thank you, Shiloh. Thank you for having me, inviting me for this conversation. I think it's very very important conversation. I think more conversation should go around this. I think we shouldn't wait as in veterans anti-war organization for a conflict to hit before we start learning about it. I think we should be in a continuous mode of learning and creating relations with people and just growing our our relations with others and whatnot, and yeah, and yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think Shiloh alluded earlier that you have supported them in their political education. And I mean, Jovanni, you've been one of the most, active and supportive members, not always in the front, but supporting to just say, hey, are you thinking about this? Are you reading this? So thank you for always being that support. If folks are connected to you, I'm sure they already know that they can reach out, and that you'll share this knowledge. And for folks who are watching us, the real thing, while we're going virtual, with these conversations, right, and really want to podcast and platform this, is that we really do understand that there's a very consistent type of narrative. And so, having participated in these American wars, in the military industrial complex, I really do feel like we can take up a small space in the discourse, so that folks feel like they know more than they did, and can do something with this knowledge that we're sharing. So get engaged in your community. If there's local organizations that's doing work, if you're not a veteran, there's a plethora. Probably if you Google, if you're a young person and on a college campus, I would encourage you to follow We Are Dissenters. They are really doing some really phenomenal work in this moment. But again, thank you so much, Jovanni. Thanks to everyone who's been riding with us on YouTube, Facebook, and across Periscope or Twitter. We will see you here next Monday. We have a nice lineup and conversation for everyone. So stick with us. We'll see you next week. Until then, be well. Take care.